morning, Director and Dr. Emil Budianto, distinguished guests and colleagues. As a representative from the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University, I'm very honored and happy to be cooperating in this workshop. And I thank Dr. Hayati Sari Hasibuan for organizing this very wonderful workshop. I feel quite inadequate to be speaking in this place, since I'm not a specialist of environmental studies, nor am I a specialist of Indonesian studies, but Professor Mizuno put me on this spot, so I have to perform. And I consulted with him, and I thought what would be the best to talk about here. I thought for young scholars and graduate students, I could speak perhaps about my own experience since my earlier career as a humanities researcher trained in anthropology, how and what I have learned in relation to the conference theme. I especially want to emphasize how environmental and sustainability studies need interdisciplinary and field-based research and a humanistic basis. Next slide, please. Maybe I do this and ask for the next slide. I'd like to first introduce the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University and how we do research at our center. Our center was founded in 1965, and this is what the president of our university said at the time. The mission of the center is to conduct comprehensive research on Southeast Asia. Rather than studying documents, we should go to local places, live together with local people, and break into an unexplored field of research to make a broader contribution to international academia. What was stressed here was the holistic understanding of society and nature of the region by interdisciplinary approach and field-based methods. From the beginning, our center was an interdisciplinary institution, not only including various disciplines from the humanities and social sciences, but what made it unique among area studies institutions in the world was the inclusion of natural sciences. I'm sorry, this is very blurry, but you can see that 1/3 of each is represented in our center. Up to this day, 1/3 of our faculty comes from science disciplines such as agronomy, forest science, engineering, medical and veterinary sciences, informatics, etc. With this interdisciplinary composition, we tackle issues that are emerging from the field. A landmark project that started in 2007 was the Sustainable Humanosphere Studies. There is now prevailing consensus that human society's expansion across the Earth has led to global warming in the geosphere and loss of biodiversity in the biosphere, and leading to an epoch-level transition in what we had in this project termed the humanosphere, which represents the whole of this. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, our societies have developed and expanded through fast-paced, productivity-driven technological change, leading to our current environmental crises. Now, towards designing a globally sustainable path, we must rehabilitate the sustainability-driven path, making use of modern technology and institutions less towards further productivity and more towards sustainability of the global environment. To do this appropriately, a humanistic perspective is important. One offshoot of the Humanosphere project was the Tropical Peatland project in Riau of northern Sumatra, led by Professor Mizuno, which I think he will be talking about later. This is the best example of an interdisciplinary field-based research of the Sustainable Humanosphere project. The productivity-driven drive for oil palm and acacia plantations dried up the peatlands, causing wide areas of forest fire. In place of the productivity-driven technology, the project researchers measured and promoted the effects of sustainability-driven technology by rehabilitating the damaged forests by plantation of varied plants, measuring the increase of biomass and carbon accumulation. This was done with participation of local communities and local officials. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about topics from my own past research in Thailand related to sustainability from a minority perspective. In May this year, the Community Forestry Act was finally enacted in Thailand. It actually took 26 years since the first bill was drafted in 1993. It was during my earlier fieldwork 3 decades ago that discussion began towards community forestry. Here I will talk about how I experienced this as a beginning anthropologist in the field. In my earliest research as a graduate student, I had been working among hill-dwelling minorities in northern Thailand called the Karen. My first long-term fieldwork, three decades ago, had to do with their religious beliefs and ritual practices. So I stayed in the village for 15 months to study the minority language and to learn not only about the theme of religion itself, but also how they make a living, what their social relationships are like, how they relate to lowland society, etc. Since then, I've been visiting the same village from time to time, so that over 30 years, whenever I have a new topic or question to consider, I first start from this original field site. I started fieldwork here in 1987. I wasn't aware at the time, but this was actually a very crucial period in the northern Thai hills, because it was around then that state policy on forest conservation started in earnest. Let me go back a bit and explain. Since 1959, the hill areas in Thailand were the targets of multiple projects under the government's hill tribe policy. The hill tribes were understood to be security threats and social problems. They were named as culprits for the loss of forest cover in the northern hills due to their shifting cultivation, especially for opium. They were blamed as lacking national consciousness and providing hiding places for communist insurgents, causing insecurity. Scholars, meanwhile, pointed out that they were made scapegoats for the larger destruction by logging companies. Power relations, especially between the upland and the lowland, minority and majority, villagers and state, are superimposed on the environmental discourse. This situation is still ongoing today, as I will explain. Thai state forestry, until mid-20th century, focused overwhelmingly on extracting timber and keeping local people away from forests. In 1961, the total forest area of Thailand was about 53% of the country. From there, forest areas were reduced by commercial logging, land resettlement, shifting cultivation, dam and road construction, land reform for agriculture, etc., and declined to 26% in 3 decades. The National Forest Policy, dated December 1985, states that the forest area of the country should be recovered and maintained at 40% of country area. In November 1988, and this was during my fieldwork, there was severe flooding in central Thailand as heavy rains washed away the soil of newly deforested slopes, causing massive floods. The Thai government banned logging in January 1989. The unintended consequence was that the price of timber tripled in Bangkok, unleashing further illegal logging. Control of swidden cultivation, especially in the watershed areas resided by the hill tribes, became severe. Control of flooding and deforestation was implemented through dam construction, delineating national park areas, forest plantation, which further delimited the hill dwellers' land use. This caused much conflict in various forested regions. The argument in the lowlands was that the hill tribes were the forest encroachers, swidden practitioners, destroying the country's precious forests and water resources. Citizenship is also an issue in the hills, as there are constant influx of population from neighboring countries, and many of the hill population did not have full citizenship, even if some had been inhabiting the hills for generations. Due to all of this, it's extremely difficult for the hill-dwelling minority to lay legitimate claims on their rights to make a living in the hills. So this was taking place during my fieldwork in the 90s. Some villagers were still conducting student cultivation in hidden patches, but they were beginning to realize that they were being watched by overhead helicopters. Control was increasing, and at workshops and seminars in Chiang Mai, there were debates about who is actually to be blamed for the loss of forest cover, hill tribes or the private company loggers. As I was conducting anthropological fieldwork on ritual and religious change in the village, I was initially unaware of the implications of increasing number of police and officials frequenting the village. Gradually, I began to realize what was going on. Let me tell you an episode about how I learned what it means to do area studies among a multidisciplinary group of scholars. I arrived at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in 1997 as a newly appointed assistant professor. At the time, I identified myself with the discipline of anthropology and had little idea about multidisciplinary area studies. Almost as soon as I started work, I had the opportunity to present in a seminar in front of all the faculty members. I talked about changing religious practices, very idealistic, and beliefs among the minority ethnic groups in Thailand's hill areas. I was showing a slide on ritual practices in the Sweden fields, talking about their religion. Then, a senior professor, an agronomist, he raised his hand and asked, "What is that tree growing in the Sweden field?" Oh, one before, please. So I couldn't answer. Then a few slides later, I was showing the village temple, which was newly built. He raised his hand again and he said, "Where did the villagers obtain the timber?" Again, I couldn't answer. At the time, I thought, why is he asking such impossible and irrelevant questions? But gradually I understood. He was giving me some important hints. I had been interested in religion, and I thought it was enough for me to interview people about their ideas and to observe their rituals and religious practices. I wasn't paying attention to their natural habitat and how they deal with it. But gradually I came to understand that even in relation to their rituals and religion, including building the Buddhist temple, their relationships with the environment was a crucial factor. And furthermore, it became increasingly important in the face of what was happening in the field at the time. I'd like to add that same applies vice versa. If you are interested in how the villagers deal with their environment, you should also know about their worldview and beliefs. When I visited the field immediately after this seminar, I heard about a proposed pine forest project that had become a big issue in the district where my field village was located. The area in upland northern Chiang Mai province is famous for beautiful pine forests. The forest industry organization under the Royal Forest Department, together with a multinational corporation from Finland and the Thai Royal Project of the King, were bringing in a project to log the pine forests, build a plywood factory in the district, and begin pine wood plantation. There were serious debates about the merits and demerits of bringing in the project. The multinational company conducted a survey to report on the local condition. They emphasized the detrimental effects of Sweden cultivation, the loss of forest, the poverty of the population, and the need for a forest-based industry. To top everything off, one of the royal family members, a prince who happened to be a member of the royal project, came, and as he was confronted by the protesting villagers, he retaliated, saying, "We are doing this for your good. If you don't agree with what we do, why don't you just go back to Burma?" These were words based on a stereotyped notion that the hill dwellers are all illegal encroachers, aliens streaming in from neighboring countries to damage the precious national resource forests. It completely offended the villagers who had lived in the area for generations and never even set foot in Burma. Most villagers considered the project to be detrimental to the sustainability of the forest, their subsistence activities, and the ecosystem that enabled it, even though they didn't talk about it in such terms. They were skeptical of the project, which professed to cut down the existing pine trees and start a pine plantation. Villagers claim that it was because they themselves, since their ancestors, took good care of the pine forests that it is thriving beautifully as it is today. I wondered who is closer to the truth. Now that I had learned the importance of talking with scientist colleagues at the center and learning about people and the environment, I asked Yamada Sensei, one of my senior colleagues who is a forest ecologist. He told me that pine forests thrive by human intervention. The fact that there were beautiful pine forests in the area of my fieldwork, he said, must mean that there had been human habitation in the area for a long time. This actually matched exactly what the villagers were claiming. In our modernist notions, we tend to think of nature as something untouched by human hands. But in fact, much of what we appreciate as beautiful nature is the outcome of human intervention or interaction. The area of my fieldwork was known for its natural, beautiful pine forests, but it's not because it's pristine nature, but rather because the hill dwellers lived there to conserve it. The question then remains, who should be given the right to use? From my own observation and understanding based on long-term fieldwork, it was not difficult to understand the logic of the villagers' opposition to the project. Visiting innumerable Karen communities in northern Thailand, I found that their villages must be situated in lush greenery, always close to a river or stream. Most Karen communities are named after a nearby stream, and their topographical location is always defined by river systems. A village surrounded by lush green forest with a running stream is Mun and Ku, meaning happy and cool or peaceful. When there's large forest fire and damage to the forest, when the land becomes excessively dry and barren, it is Zihohago, meaning hot, red, and broken village, or Zihago Buhago, meaning broken village and damaged rice harvest. Karen villagers believe that harvest in the rice fields, forested, cool environment, and peaceful human condition are all mutually reflective. In order to sustain coolness and happiness, the human community needs to be peaceful and in harmony and balance with the forest. And of course, the local villagers share ecological knowledge in their own way, for example, about when and which forests to cut down for Sweden and which forests to conserve. A meeting was held in the village where local hill villagers as well as lowland villagers and environmentalists, monks, academics, and journalists gathered to protest the project. The protests were successful, and the pine forest project was ultimately rejected. The strategy that brought their victory was, one, to emphasize the many generations that they have inhabited the region and maintained the pine forests. Two, that they were neither illegal nor alien encroachers, but proper Buddhists who had all respected the king, no different from the lowland Thais. Three, speaking up about indigenous knowledge, verbalizing their knowledge in order to convince lowlanders that they have been living sustainably in the forests. And four, that they were able to mobilize a large network of people, including the lowlanders. So this was a small local victory. Into the 90s and 2000s, there were innumerable cases such as this one, some victorious and some losses, and it's still ongoing. The timing of the Pine Forest Project coincided with the UN Indigenous Peoples Decade, and a few years later I began to hear the global discourse on indigenous knowledge. Since the 1990s, similar movements by local ethnic minorities supporting NGOs, academics, and journalists were taking place in many areas, claiming that local inhabitants should be given the right to use and protect their forests. Due to this, since the late 1990s, there has been significant interest among lowland Thais in how the hill-dwelling minorities made sustainable living in the forest. The hill dwellers were gradually finding voice to speak up. As I mentioned in the beginning, the Community Forestry Act took a long time, 3 decades deliberating, and was finally enacted this year in May. It demonstrates how difficult it is for the forest administration to give initiative to forest use to the inhabitants. The main thrust of the bill is to allow local residents living in the forest to work with the state to manage and use natural resources in a sustainable way. Villagers must draw up a 5-year plan on the use and conservation of the forest in their community, and the plan is subject to evaluation every 5 years. The bill defines community forests as those that are outside conservation areas managed by the state, allowing villagers living in reserved forests to use and manage its resources after registering with the government. Considering there had never been a law empowering local residents to make decisions on managing their environment, the bill is truly significant. However, it's already criticized to be too limited in its scope and risks further marginalizing hundreds of communities that live outside the areas covered by the Act, namely the state conservation areas such as national parks. These communities depend on the forest, and at the same time, many of them actually help sustain it. Forest-dependent communities have frequently clashed with authorities and are often charged with trespassing and are evicted. In June 2015, Prime Minister Prayut attributed a severe drought to massive deforestation in the north, which was causing the loss of rainfall. This year, the current forest fire and haze problem is again attributed to the hill dwellers as the cause of environmental problems. So the debate goes on, and the hill dwellers remain the most frequent and easy scapegoats. There's nationwide concern over the adverse environmental impacts of deforestation, such as water shortages in the dry season, destructive floods in the wet season, loss of biodiversity, and global warming. At the same time, the division of opinion over who should be put in charge of rehabilitating the land, the local people or those with political and or economic power, still continues.
5 minutes more, please.
I had to rush through the turn of events and discussion on this. This is actually still ongoing debate, even after the Community Forestry Act has finally been enacted. What I wanted to emphasize in this is that, firstly, the environmental issues are entrenched in the socio-political context of power relations. The SDGs spells out that reducing inequality and poverty must go together with environmental issues. Secondly, in order to accomplish sustainability goals in the true sense, there needs to be a fine balance between the larger institutional understanding on the one hand and an understanding of fine-grained local perspectives and good dialogue with and among the various local perspectives. For this, we need fieldwork on various levels and interdisciplinary perspectives. That's all. Thank you very much.